Hello, and welcome to the Geocurrents lecture series on the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections. This lecture covers the creation of the presidency and the Electoral College. So, to begin, it's important to note that the founders of the United States were immersed in the political philosophy of the classical world and used Republican Rome as the model rather than democratic Athens, or at least relatively democratic Athens. The desire was to create a republic on democratic foundations, not a democracy per se. And the term democracy actually had relatively negative connotations until it was embraced by Andrew Jackson and his fellows in the 1820s and 1830s with the creation of the modern Democratic Party. Originally, democracy connoted mob rule or something to that effect. There was a real focus among the founders on ancient Rome's transition from a republic to an empire and a profound determination to try to avoid that fate. I find it interesting that this analogy is still being used. To illustrate, I have an recent article from the Free Press, noting that the dynamic between Trump and his haters, to quote here, changed the chemistry of American politics, with Trump leading rallies with his fans chanting "lock her up," referring to Hillary Clinton, and then 8 years later, something similar has happened on the other side. So the point being made is a republic can unravel when this sort of rhetoric becomes common. Back to the time of the founding, for the creators of the United States, looking back at ancient Rome, Cato the Younger, the conservative opponent of Julius Caesar, was the model rather than Caesar himself. Caesar was widely despised as someone who played a major role in destroying the Roman Republic and turning it into an empire. And Brutus, one of his assassins, was actually quite admired. To illustrate here, I have a bit of information from the Journal of the American Revolution on Rome's heroes and American founding fathers. And it notes here that Cato, who actually committed suicide rather than to submit to Caesar, who was willing to forgive him, but Cato was elevated by the founders to a model of public and private virtue, and that Patrick Henry's famous quote, "Give me liberty or give me death," was inspired by a play in which Cato exclaimed pretty much the same thing. By the same token, George Washington was idolized as, quote, the American Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was a figure from remote Roman history from very early in the Republic, 6th century, actually, so it's rather legendary. But supposedly he was a farmer who was at his plow, and a disaster was about to strike the Roman city-state due to an invasion, and Cincinnatus was summoned to take control and actually sort of serve as a dictator, but achieve victory in 16 days, relinquish power, and return to labor on his farm. There's a lot of mythology here. What we know about Cincinnatus was he was actually a patrician who upheld patrician privilege, in other words, an aristocrat. I find it somewhat unlikely that he was engaged in that kind of manual farm work, although at the time it's, I suppose, possible, but he certainly would have had on his estate numerous laborers. So, like I say, there's a bit of mythology involved here. The founders certainly wanted a mixed government with a lot of checks and balances and separations of power. And they did look back not just to Roman thinkers, but to Greek thinkers as well, who informed the Roman thinkers in question. And Aristotle's work on politics was very important here, where he outlined basic forms of government. And the emphasis here was on a system with one ruler, a monarchy, which could deteriorate into a tyranny, or a few rulers, which would basically be an aristocracy, forming some sort of republic, and that could degenerate into an oligarchy or plutocracy. And then many rulers, which would essentially be democracy, or what might be called direct democracy. Aristotle was operating in the situation of Greek city-states, which were really quite small, and so you could have this direct democracy. But that could then deteriorate into anarchy. And so one fixating problem was how to get this right. And besides Aristotle, another very important Greek thinker was Polybius. Polybius was a Greek, well, thinker and political actor. He was taken to Rome as a hostage after the defeat of the Greek city-states, and became heavily involved with the Scipio family. I was almost sort of brought into that very important family, which was very interested in Hellenizing, in other words, adopting Greek cultural and literary forms. And Polybius wrote a very influential work on Rome's rise, and actually foretold its eventual demise, or at least problems. So Polybius had an idea. A lot of it was derived from Aristotle, but he developed it on his own, of a political cycle which would move from monarchy rule by one, then to could deteriorate into tyranny and despotism, and then be replaced by an aristocracy ruled by the nobility, and that could devolve by corruption into oligarchy, and then be replaced by democracy ruled by many, and then the democracy could fall to a demagogue, and then to mob rule, reversion to tyranny, and then the cycle kind of repeats. So what Polybius was doing several things. One, he was trying to explain why Rome was able to rise the way it did, why this one city-state was able to essentially conquer the Mediterranean world. And Polybius thought one of the main reasons why it was able to do this was because it combined the different aspects of politics as outlined by Aristotle. So to go back to that slide, Rome, as a republic, it never had one ruler, but it did have two consuls who were elected by an assembly in which people's votes were based on their class position, essentially. But it was the consuls were elected. There were two of them, and they served for 1 year. And then the ancient Roman Republic had the Senate, which was essentially an aristocracy. And then they had a number of different popular assemblies voted by the people, which would then be the many. So Polybius thought it had this unique attribute where it combined the benefits of one ruler, or in the case of Republican Rome, two, and then few rulers, the Senate, and many, the directly elected assemblies. But Polybius thought eventually the cycle would come into play, and Rome could not anticipate maintaining its position. Actually, of course, Rome did not maintain it, but it didn't. But at the same time, it didn't undergo what Polybius foresaw. So I've just taken that diagram, which I borrowed, and have extracted part of it and added to it. So with Rome, you had originally a monarchy, at least by legend, and then that gave way to this unique mixed government that Polybius liked so much. But you certainly did have corruption of the elites. That's how Roman historians saw it, anyway. Of course, there was much more to it, which then led to despotism and essentially monarchy, which is what happened under the Roman Empire. And under the Roman Empire, we do see dynastic disasters. We see near-state collapse in the 3rd century, especially. The Roman Empire was almost over, or so it seemed, but then it was revived, and this happened several times. But then there's just return to monarchy, so you don't get the kind of complex cycle that Polybius foresaw. But anyway, back to the United States. What the founders wanted was a mixed government for this new republic. So they wanted presidency, which would be the one who would be elected, but indirectly, elected by an electoral college, which is based on the individual states. So it's actually a relatively small number of electors who actually were to choose the president. Then you'd have the Senate, the few, and they were also to be indirectly elected, elected by state legislatures, not by the popular vote. And that was true all the way up until the 20th century. And then the House of Representatives, which was the many, directly elected by, well, not by everyone, but by free men. and at the time, free men who paid taxes or held property. You wouldn't get full democratization among free white men until the Jacksonian period, 1830s essentially. And then to compound this, you'd have similar systems at state and local levels. It was not an easy sell necessarily. This is what certainly Madison and Hamilton wanted, and was able to eventually be pushed through with the ratification of the Constitution. But there were plenty of anti-constitutional admirers of Cato, back to the end, Cato the Younger, and in ancient Rome, who really feared that the Constitution would give the president too much power. So Cato was adopted as a pen name of an anonymous author who published pamphlets against the Constitution. In one of these, taking issue with the tone and arrogance of the Federalist ally Caesar, which meant Alexander Hamilton, and Hamilton did want a relatively strong presidency. And also in another one, pointing out that the president's vague powers could lead to a European-style unrepresentative system. People who are opposed to the Constitution, or at least concerned about it, also argued that a really healthy, functional republic based on a certain degree of democratic foundations had to be very small in territory. And here they were following Montesquieu, who was one of the key thinkers of the French Enlightenment, very influential for the founders. And Montesquieu had argued, to quote here, in an extensive republic, the public good is sacrificed to 1,000 private views. It is subordinate to exceptions and depends on accidents. In a small one, the interest of the public is more obvious, better understood, and more within the reach of every citizen. So basically looking back to the city-state model of ancient Greece, where you can actually have a direct democracy. And the United States at the time of its founding had well over 3 million people and covered a extensive territory. And you certainly couldn't have this sort of direct democracy or even the kind of republic that people like Montesquieu and Aristotle had admired. So the Federalist Papers, written primarily by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, also Jay contributed to them, but Madison and Hamilton were the main authors. And these were written to convince the American public to ratify the Constitution and create a federal government. But Madison refuted Montesquieu and his American followers. I follow here George Clinton, but there were many. George Clinton of New York. But Madison argued, yes, well, of course, a direct democracy like ancient Athens must be very small, but not a representative republic with adequate checks and balances, which he and Hamilton were contriving to create. But anyway, heated debates over the proper powers of the national or federal government continued for decades. So while Madison and Hamilton had collaborated extensively on the Federalist Papers and other projects, they eventually had a falling out because Hamilton wanted a more powerful central government, and he wanted institutions like a national bank. He wanted the federal government to assume state debts. He wanted active federal intervention in the economy to develop infrastructure, to protect businesses with tariffs, to sort of tie the country together and enhance its economic growth. Whereas Madison thought that Hamilton was pushing for too much federal power, argued that centralization risks tyranny and that federal intervention would favor elites and undermine authority of the constituent states. Now, as I will mention in later lections, Madison had quite a change of heart in a lot of these issues when he became president. And actually adopted a lot of things that Hamilton had wanted, not entirely, but to some extent, which then led to people who call themselves the old Republicans to oppose what Madison was doing. So we'll talk about those in later lectures. I do want to note that there's some real confusing terminology that results from all of this. So if we look at the world today and take on the concept of federalism in terms of, say, a federal government or a federal republic, what that refers to in contemporary or general political discourse is a system, a political system and a philosophy in which central state power is limited. So a federal state, in this sense, is contrasted with a unitary state. So the U.S. would be a classical federal state where the constituent states have a lot of authority and they cannot simply be changed by the dictates of the central government, where a unitary state, and France is often taken as the quintessential unitary state, the divisions of that state, departments, for example, in the case of France, are get their power from the central government. It's a more downward flowing system, and you don't have constitutions for these constituent units. They don't have their own legal codes. Whereas in a federal state, and you can see the federal states there in green, the constituent units are very important. But in early American political discourse, federalism actually meant those who wanted more central authority because they were not arguing against proponents of a unitary state. What they were arguing against were proponents of a confederation as opposed to a federation. They may sound like very similar things, but they're really quite different. So in a confederation, ultimate sovereignty is lodged with the constituent units, not with the larger whole. In a confederacy, the individual units can withdraw when they want. So not only do they have their own laws and own constitutions, they are part of the larger entity by virtue of their will, and if they want to retract that will, they can leave. So this was a big issue in the United States all the way up to the Civil War, where in the Civil War you had the secession of the southern states who formed a confederacy. So I tried to capture this in a map here where I have in the Confederate States of America, which I know is a confederation of sovereign states. I have a slightly different gray shade for each one, where I don't do that with the constituent states of the United States, which was a sovereign federation, where ultimate sovereignty is lodged with the central government. It's a little bit nuanced, but it's a very important distinction to make. You also get confusing terminology with the term state, because in political science, a state basically means a sovereign political territorial entity. But in federal states, they are divided into constituent states. So this map shows the term used, translated into English, for the largest or first order divisions of every country in the world. And you can see there are a lot of terms that are used: province, state, region, federal subject in the case of Russia. I mean, on and on and on it goes. But all the blue ones are states or sovereign countries, independent countries, whose main divisions are called states, either in English or their term in their own language is usually translated into English as state. And those blue countries, it's close to the federal states on this map, but not entirely. Canada is divided into provinces, but it's actually a system. You can see here divided into provinces, but those provinces are pretty similar to U.S. states in terms of their autonomy. And this was reflected anyway in how the United States was referred to. Up until the Civil War, the United States was considered a plural entity. People would say the United States are rather than the United States is, because the United States are this collection of states. And so this has been analyzed to determine when the switch over happened. And it's also important to note there's still a lot of struggle in the U.S. between federal and state authority. It has been an ongoing issue. It was huge in the post-World War II civil rights struggle, where most people in the southern states thought that it was not the prerogative of the federal government to determine civil rights laws, and it was a state issue, arguing that from a strict construction of the Constitution. But we can see it today in the abortion debate and many other issues. Just to give one interesting example, there was an astounding reversal of political philosophy and fortune in the 1950s and 60s over precisely this issue. So if you go back to 1956, the Democratic candidate for president, Adlai Stevenson, was personally, very much a liberal, very much a believer in civil rights, but he also, partly for political necessity, uh, did not want the federal government to intervene too heavily in the southern states and how they were to deal with the civil rights challenge. He thought that a movement towards full civil rights for blacks in the South should be a gradual process and one in which the states had to be involved. He didn't want the federal government to simply dictate it. And you could see what states did he win? Well, he won Missouri, but outside of that, the other states were, well, largely in the deep South. A few sort of more northern, southern states, but basically he triumphed in the deep South and lost the rest of the country. And then in 1964, you can see a total inversion of that map when Lyndon Johnson was running as a Democrat against Barry Goldwater, a Republican. And Johnson, a Southerner from Texas, had come around to the position that the federal government really had to push through civil rights legislation. Goldwater, a Republican, just sort of reversed what had been the basic Republican line, which was historically anyway, that the federal government should be involved, and said, like Stevenson had, even more so than Stevenson, that no, this is not an issue for the federal government. Goldwater said, I'm personally very much in favor of civil rights for blacks, but it's a state matter. And you could see, other than his home state of Arizona, all the states he won were deep South states, some of which had never voted for a Republican. So quite an interesting shift. And today, as I mentioned, legal status of abortion is a huge issue. As was under Roe v. Wade, a federal issue decided not by the legislature but by the Supreme Court. And then when Roe v. Wade was overturned, it's thrown back to the states. And you could see current status of abortion in the United States. A lot of states it's banned or essentially banned in most or almost all cases. Whereas in many states it's legal, in many cases fully legal all the way up to pregnancy. I believe that Donald Trump thought that with the overturn of Roe v. Wade, and the issue is sort of pushed back to the state level, that would, well, maybe not end the abortion controversy, but at least greatly decrease its importance in U.S. politics. And that hasn't happened at all, because Democrats are basically arguing this should be a national federal issue and not a state issue. Or finally, one other thing, we could take the issue of marijuana or cannabis laws. In the United States, according to federal law, cannabis is a Schedule I drug, which means it has no legitimate uses whatsoever. Cocaine and morphine are Schedule II. The federal government says, yes, they do have legitimate medical uses, as they do. So by federal law, cannabis is more illegal, if we could say that, than cocaine or morphine. But yet, you could see the law, state laws, many more people live in states where cannabis is legal, either entirely legal for so-called recreational use or legal for medical use. There's a real disconnection here between federal and state law. Because federal law is supposed to override state law, except when it doesn't, like as in this case. So let's now turn to the Electoral College. So under the U.S. Constitution, the president is indirectly elected through the constituent states. That shows the federalism at the heart of the U.S. In the Electoral College, Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution specifies, it's very short, but it specifies that each state chooses members of the Electoral College in a manner directed by their legislatures. So states determine how they do this. And the state's electors equal their combined representation in the House and Senate, which gives a little more electoral clout to small states, because all states have 2 senators, whereas the House is determined by population. And then the president is selected by a simple majority in the Electoral College. And if there's no majority, then that election it becomes what's called a contingent election, and it goes to the House of Representatives. And each state's House delegation votes as a block. And this has happened only a few times in American history, but it was very momentous elections when it did happen. And in the early republic, different states chose their electors through different methods. So we could see here the election of 1800 when Thomas Jefferson defeated the incumbent president, John Adams. Very, very important election. And you could see the Electoral College results. You could see most states giving all of their electors to one candidate. Some states, you could see here, Pennsylvania, for example, and North Carolina, dividing them. And so, I mean, that's still true to this day. And in the same election, you could see on the map on the right that in most states, it was the state legislatures who chose the electors. And in a few states, it was a popular vote. Interesting. One state in the north, Rhode Island, a mid-Atlantic state, Maryland, and then a couple of southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, and Kentucky. And they could do it either in a statewide election, as was true in Virginia, or in district elections, as were true in the other states. So a lot of state leeway in how this was done. So as a result, when I give lectures in this same series, for individual presidential elections, we're going to see in the early years our county level mapping is very limited because most states in this early period did not employ the popular vote at all. And some of them did employ the popular vote. In some elections, returns are missing from counties. But in the 1800 election, we have county level returns that were preserved in Rhode Island and Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and Kentucky. And you could see that there's real diversity here, at least in Maryland, well, Rhode Island too, but Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, with some areas favoring the Democratic Republican candidate Thomas Jefferson, other the Federalist candidate and incumbent John Adams. Note in Kentucky, relatively new state, every single county has returns with over 90% for Jefferson. And that is a topic that I will be discussing at some length in later lectures of how the western or more frontier states generally incline toward a more democratic mode of governance. Jefferson was definitely had more democratic beliefs than Adams did. Adams was sort of suspicious of having a mass franchise. But one of the reasons why the U.S. did turn to more democratic modes of governance was the importance of the western territories, and then as they became states. As far as current day goes, every 48 states and the District of Columbia have a winner-take-all system where whoever has the majority or plurality popular vote in the presidential election, the electors associated with that person are to vote in mass, so winner take all. It works different in two states, Maine and Nebraska, and both relatively small states, but in both of them, the statewide winner will take 2 votes. The electors pledged to the statewide winner will get 2 votes. That's for the 2 senators. And then the winner in each congressional district will take 1. So that's why Nebraska and Maine have split or can have split electoral votes. And for example, Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, based in Omaha, by far the largest city, went for Biden. The state as a whole went for Donald Trump, but Biden got 1 electoral vote from Nebraska. That district has been redistricted, as happened after the 2000 census returns came in, and there's a lot of speculation of which way it will go this time. So it's up for grabs to some extent. And Maine works the same way, only in this case there's just 2 congressional districts rather than 3 in the case of Nebraska. And the Northern Congressional District, number 2, went for Trump in 2020, but it's currently represented in the House by a Democrat. So that's uncertain as well. One of the problems with the Electoral College, and there are several, but one is the issue of faithless electors. So electors are pledged to a certain candidate, but they don't necessarily vote for that candidate. And there are current laws about this. You could see in some states the vote, a faithless elector, the vote will be voided with a penalty, and some will be counted with a penalty, and some will simply be counted. So it varies a lot. And it's interesting that 2016 was a banner year for faithless electors. You could see, to read from the slide here, on election night, Trump got 306 electors and Hillary Clinton got 232. However, because of 7 faithless electors, 5 Democratic and 2 Republican, Trump actually received 304 votes to Clinton's 227. So continuing the potential problem of the faithless elector. It's important to note that voting in the early republic was not at all like voting today. There was no secret ballot, also called the Australia ballot. Australia pioneered this. That wasn't used at a state level until 1888 in Massachusetts. It was widely used shortly thereafter, 1892, and it became standard in the early 20th century. That was sort of another round of democratic reforms that the country underwent during the so-called progressive era. But not only that, in fact, there were no ballots in the early republic. Just to quote here, the most succinct way of addressing this issue I got off of Chat GPT. But anyway, to quote it, printed ballots were first used in U.S. presidential elections in 1824. Before this, voters either wrote the names of candidates on pieces of paper or orally delivered their votes. And then 1824 saw the introduction of pre-printed ballots, but they weren't printed by the government. They were printed by the political parties and featured only their candidates. What would happen in elections, elections were a big deal at this time. And you'd have party operatives who would be there to people queuing up to vote, and then would offer their ballots, and people would take the ballots depending on which party or candidates they favored. But anyway, the use of official government printed ballots designed to ensure fairness and privacy became widespread with the adoption of the secret ballot, late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Electoral College, the number of electoral votes per state changes after each census because the number is determined by the state's representation in Congress, both the Senate and the House. And so the states will lose or gain electoral votes depending on their population change. A state can lose an electoral vote even if it gains population, if it gains less population than the average state. So you could see, but from 2020 to 2024, reflecting the 2020 census, you see a number of states gaining, those are in blue, and a number of states losing, those are in a light tan color, essentially. So a couple of states gained 1, Texas gained 2, and a number lost. If you look at this by the political leanings of each state, I've outlined them here of whether they are red or blue in the most recent election. And just to add it all together, we can see that the red states gained, by that I mean Republican voting states in the last election, gained 2 electoral votes. Blue states overall lost 1, and purple states, swing states, lost 1. So you can see Pennsylvania, purple state, lost 1. Michigan, a purple state, lost 1. But North Carolina, another purple state, gained 1. Also important to note is the electoral vote. The number of votes each state had, throughout the whole history of the U.S. Republic, they've changed a lot because of population change. But just looking at the early republic, one thing to note, look at 1800. The 2 top states in terms of population were Virginia and Massachusetts. And the first presidents were all from Virginia or Massachusetts. So you had Washington from Virginia, and then John Adams from Massachusetts, and then you went through Thomas Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, all from Virginia, and then John Quincy Adams, Massachusetts background. But that's changing. So New York actually in 1800 was below Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. But by 1812, New York is on top, and Virginia is number two. And then just to sort of trace these out, in 1824, New York was well ahead of any other state, and Virginia had dropped down to third place. Virginia was still in third place in 1836. You could see 1856, before the Civil War, Virginia was down to the fourth place, surpassed by Ohio. And then we go right after the Civil War, after Reconstruction is mostly over and the South has been readmitted to the Union. You can see Virginia is down to 10th place, tied with three other states. Partly that's because Virginia was divided, with the western counties seceding from Virginia to stay in the Union. So West Virginia with 5. But it's just important to note how different states have different importance in elections due to their different numbers of electoral votes, which is always changing. As the U.S. gradually became more democratic, and this was especially in the period of Jacksonian democracy, late 1820s, 1830s, a big increase in states having direct election for electors rather than having their legislatures elect them. But we get a problem emerging when winners of the popular vote are losing elections, because there's more and more emphasis on the popular vote. But in 1824, there were 4 main candidates. No one came close to a majority, either in the Electoral College or the popular vote, but Andrew Jackson had the largest number of highest percentage of popular vote and the most electoral votes. But since nobody has half of the electoral votes, it goes to Congress. It goes to the House of Representatives, and they chose John Quincy Adams. This was highly controversial because one of the other candidates, Henry Clay, threw his support to John Quincy Adams. That enabled Adams to win in the House of Representatives, and Adams almost immediately then, on becoming president, named Henry Clay Secretary of State, the second most powerful position in the federal government. Certainly at that time it was. And Jackson and his supporters regarded this as a corrupt bargain. 1876, after the Civil War, was perhaps even more problematic. So you can see it was a razor-tight election, both in the Electoral College and the popular vote, especially in the Electoral College. There were also a number of challenged electors, especially in southern states that had been readmitted to the Union. So it was an absolute mess. But eventually, the election went to the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. But again, there was a bargain made, often considered a corrupt bargain, that in exchange for Hayes assuming the presidency, that the U.S. would really pull back on Reconstruction of the South and allow southern states to begin disenfranchising black voters. It was a prolonged process. It took a few decades, but eventually that would happen. So there's a lot of criticism of that. 1888 election, the incumbent Grover Cleveland received higher percentage of the popular vote than did the Republican Benjamin Harrison, but Benjamin Harrison had a clear victory in the Electoral College. This one was not as contentious. There is a story, though, that Cleveland's wife, Frances Cleveland, if I remember her name correctly, said on leaving, somebody asked about some of the drapes or some of the decoration in the White House, and she says, "Well, don't worry about it. We'll be back," as they were, because Cleveland was going to win the next election in 1892. The only president who was had an interrupted two-term presidency. That may happen again in 2024. And then 2000, where Al Gore won the popular vote. You can see neither one had 50%, as there were some minor parties involved. And it wasn't at all clear who won the Electoral College because of voting issues and irregularities in Florida. Essentially, this went to Supreme Court, which gave those votes to George W. Bush, who became president. Al Gore withdrew and decided not to continue challenging it. And then in 2016, this was the largest gap, where you can see again neither one of them won a majority of the votes, but Clinton had a clear plurality. You can see 65,800,000 votes to 62,900,000, but yet a clear Electoral College victory by Donald Trump. It's quite possible that the same sort of thing will happen in the 2024 election. Right now, polling mostly shows mostly shows Kamala Harris with an edge, a small edge in the popular vote, but Donald Trump polling as of right now is giving him a slight edge in the Electoral College. There's also several scenarios for an Electoral College tie. And the website, the Liberal Patriot here, associated with Rui Teixeira, although the author of this article is Nate Moore, has 3 different possibilities for an Electoral College tie, in which case it would be a contingent election, would go to the House, and because the Republicans control most House delegations from states, it would almost certainly then go to Donald Trump. There are many criticisms of the Electoral College. One is that it favors less populated states, which tend Republican, although not as much as many people think. I think this is an issue, but it's not the biggest issue with the Electoral College. So, for example, a state like North Dakota has 3 electoral votes, but if it were based simply on its population, it would have only 1, because it has 1 House member and 2 Senate members, and that's the same with many other states. The base map here shows the situation before the 2020 census, so I have in parentheses the current electoral count. So, for example, Montana went from 3 to 4 electoral votes. But if we look at the least populated states, the one where this imbalance between their population and their number of electoral votes, and I'm limiting this to states with 3 or 4 electoral votes, 3 or 4 undivided electoral votes. I'm not counting Maine because it divides it by congressional district. But what we interestingly find is 6 red and 6 blue. So for Republican states that voted in the most recent election and for the Republican candidate anyway, you can see we have Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota. But then when we look at the same situation with blue states, we have Hawaii, we have District of Columbia, we have Delaware, we have Rhode Island, we have Vermont, and we have New Hampshire. So as I said, this is an issue. I won't deny that, but partly because you go up to the next level of relatively lightly populated states, and at that next higher up level, there are quite a few more Republican or red states than blue or Democratic voting states. And a bigger issue, I think, at least in my mind, is the Electoral College partially disenfranchises people in landslide states. So a landslide state is one, different ways to define it, but it's often defined as one in which one candidate gets 20% or more, a higher level, greater vote than the opposing one. So this map color coding states by most recent election, and showing in purple states that were within 1 to 4% margin, either voting for the Democratic or the Republican candidate. But you can see there in dark red, we see Republican landslide states, and then in dark blue, Democratic landslide states. And you get a bit more of the landslide effect in some of these Republican states. One way to, I think, really conceptualize this is by doing a reduction to the absurd. So take an admittedly absurd situation, which will illustrate well this imbalance that results from the Electoral College. So let's just imagine a situation where candidate A gets 100% of the vote in all those orange states, and then would take 268 electoral votes. And then let's imagine candidate B wins with just by one individual vote. Let's just say a margin of one in all of those sort of greenish or bluish greenish states. They would actually then win the election with 270 electoral votes and get essentially 25% of the popular vote. So that would be the most extreme situation. And in such an admittedly absurd situation, any one person in any of those greenish states, if one person in any of them were to have changed his or her vote, the election would have gone the other way. Whereas in the orange states, you would have had to have had essentially half the voters change their vote. So that's pretty imbalanced. And that's, you look at campaigning today, it's all focused on the swing states. There's not much presidential campaigning in California or certainly a place like Wyoming, because there's no doubt of how the election is going to go in that state. There is an intensifying desire to eliminate the Electoral College. In terms of the current electoral cycle, Democratic vice presidential candidate Tim Walz came out against the Electoral College. And my impression is most Democrats would certainly like to get rid of it, but it's a contentious and problematic issue, and the Harris campaign distanced themselves from that. But just a few recent headlines here. Brookings Institute headline on "It's time to abolish it." Pew Research Center found a majority of Americans continue to favor moving away. Now, I'm not exactly sure what it means to move away from it. There are different options. And a Newsweek article saying it's finally in sight. Well, is it? I'm not so sure at all. There's big controversies over how difficult or easy it would be to actually eliminate it. So here's an NPR article saying that it's more complicated than it would seem, and then here's Harvard Political Review saying it's not as hard as you might think. But to quote the Harvard Political Review article, maybe not hard, but certainly kind of complicated. So there's an innovative legislative proposal called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Goes back to 2006. It's a feasible alternative mechanism for instituting a national popular vote system. Let me back up a bit, because just eliminating the Electoral College would call for a change in the Constitution, an amendment, and that's not easy to do. You got to get state support for it. But anyway, to go back to quoting this, so this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact operates on a simple premise. It requires participating states to allocate their electoral votes to the presidential candidate who wins the national popular vote, regardless of the state level results. And this is possible because the states can allocate those electoral votes however they want. That's a state issue. It's not a federal issue. But anyway, back to the quote. This approach ensures that the popular vote winner becomes president, bypassing the winner-take-all approach. This compact employs the concept of faithless electors, because that it would have to be, the electors would have to agree not necessarily to vote for the candidate they're pledged to, depending on who wins the national popular vote. So it's kind of an intricate sort of idea. It definitely has appeal to some people, but I have a hard time imagining that this is going to make much headway. Well, it's possible, but I doubt it. In earlier times, there was a pretty powerful movement to eliminate it by amending the Constitution. This was 1969. 1968 election was won by Richard Nixon, the Republican, over the Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey. Nixon got a very clear Electoral College win, but the popular vote was quite close. Nixon took that too, but it was close. So there was concern about this, and there was this Electoral College abolition amendment. It passed in the House with bipartisan support, really kind of overwhelming, 339 to 70. Republican President Richard Nixon endorsed it and encouraged the Senate to pass it, but it was filibustered by Southern conservatives and senators from small states, including some Democrats. So it obviously didn't happen. There's been recent efforts to make the Electoral College less representative, because you have this situation now with these two states, Nebraska and Maine, which have a more representative system where the congressional districts, some of the votes are allocated to congressional districts. But Trump was really pressuring Nebraska, a very red state, pressuring its legislature to change the law in Nebraska to go to a winner-take-all system, because he's certainly going to win Nebraska overall, but not necessarily in that Omaha congressional district. A good chance he'll lose that. But interestingly, in Nebraska, even though it's a very red state, they shot down Trump's plan, angering Donald Trump quite a bit. But it's also important to note that the Democrats themselves were not concerned much about the Electoral College in the time period after 2000 to 2016, when they thought they had a so-called blue wall of states that were consistently voting in presidential elections for the Democratic candidate, and that so-called blue wall wasn't enough to give them control, but it was considered pretty close. And so the sort of push to eliminate the Electoral College among Democrats lost a lot of its steam. But as we all know, that blue wall was breached in 2016 when Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin all narrowly went for Trump. Then in the 2020 election, they returned to blue, but in a very, very narrow vote margin. And right now, these are the three most important states in determining the 2024 election. Now, they're not the only ones. Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina have also been considered in play and could go to either candidate. But Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Pennsylvania certainly the most populous of those states. Georgia and North Carolina have fairly large populations as well. So there's going to be a lot of attention on these states. Well, there certainly has been with campaigning. So that's all I have right now. I will do the second half of this lecture and post it soon, which is on the development of the political party system in the United States. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you can tune in to subsequent lectures. Thank you.